going to implement this multi-step form using React, we will be using two custom hooks for this purpose. So the hooks will also make sure that there is validation such that in this personal step, for example, the full name is required, the last name is required. That means I cannot go to the next step unless I've filled in this part. When I go to the next step and then I come back, then the values that were filled should be pre-filled. All right, let's test something here. For example, so I can go next, and then when I come back, I can still see the values and I can submit the button. All right, so this is what we'll be implementing, and let's get started. So first things first, before we even begin, you notice that we have a header section, we have the content section, right? We have the navigation section, and we also have the footer section. So these are all components. We have them set up as components so that they can actually get to just display what they need to display. For example, this part will only display the current step. This one will just be an indicator, and this one is for going back and forth. So let's take a look at this, how they are individually in the code before we continue. Okay, so as we look at this sign up form, we notice that each and every section is separated and it accepts its own inputs. So the first one is the header component, this section here, all right? So it accepts the active step, and the active step is of type multi-step. So when we look at the type multi-step, we see that it has a key that identifies that step, for example, personal, for example, contact information, and so forth. Then there is a label. This label is what is actually displayed on the UI. Finally, there is the component. This is what will now be rendered, okay? And we will see that later on. All right. Now, if we look at the navigation component, we see that it has available steps. These are all the total available steps, yeah, for the sign up. Then it has the active step, it has the on next step event emitter, and the on submit event emitter, and finally whether the current step is valid or not. The reason for this one is so that we can disable the next button, okay? Finally, we look at the footer and we see that the footer accepts the active step and the available steps so that it can decide like which one should be displayed in active manner. For example, we go next, we see that it changes, okay? All right. So if we expand our sign up component, the first thing that we get to see is our hooks. And the hooks is the use multi-step form hook, okay? So let's take a look at what this does, yeah? So the definition of a hook, as you can see at the top, it starts with a use. You have to start with use because that's how React will recognize it. But you want to focus on what it's returning, okay? First of all, we see there is a get form function that is returned. All this does is that it reduces the form. Once we have reached the end, like we are in the personal, we go to the contact details, then we fill the email right here. Then we go to the next step. We say like here, for example, 8, 1. Then we go to the next step and then we agree. And then if we submit, we should see all the details we have just filled in. All right, so that is what get form will do. It will reduce all the views that we have. It will reduce the personal, it will reduce the contact and so forth and experience, and then it will return for us a reduced form. All right. Okay, as for the current form step is simply a state that will give us the most current step that the user is at, okay? Then register available steps. What it does is that it accepts all the available steps and then it sets them, registering them in the state of this hook, okay? Then we have the option to set the active step index when we move forward or backward, okay? And when we set the index, what will happen is that we will actually set the current form step based on the index, okay? So the value of the current form step will be an actual like multi-step, okay? Then we can select initial fields. What this does is that it picks. You remember when we said we can move forward and backward, like we go back, that is where the select initial fields comes into the picture, so that we can actually get what was filled before. Then we can patch the current views form with the already existing values, okay? Then the other thing is available steps. What this does is that it gives us the value of the available steps that we have actually registered. This one tells us if the current step that the user is at is actually valid, if it has been validated by its own state, okay? So that we can be able to move on to the next one, all right? And then this one will tell us whether the current step that the user is at is a valid one. Okay, remember those are two things. One is for setting the validity, the other one is for setting, like giving us the value. And you can see here it's setting the validity. Okay, and then finally and most importantly, on view field change, what this does is that it accepts the view, for example, personal details, the field that was changed, for example, the first name, and then the value of the first name, all right? And then it sets it in the forms view. So if we take a look at our forms view, we see it's a useref because we don't need to keep on re-rendering whenever the form view changes, the global form view changes, all right? We don't need to keep re-rendering. The other thing I want you to note is the use of use callback. We are using use callback in so many methods. Why is that the case? We want to persist any data that was there. It's called memoization. We want to make sure that we don't keep on re-rendering things as changes are happening if there is no need to re-render, okay? So I encourage you to go and take a look at what use callback does and how it can best suit your needs, all right? Because that is out of the scope of this tutorial. Now, if we go back to our component, we should see in our use effect, we are actually starting to register the available steps. And these available steps are the sign up steps. If you recall now, we finally get to expand the sign up steps, and it's an array of type multi-step. We see that we have the key, as we said, the label, as we said, and finally the component. Why is this important? Okay, let's jump all the way to this part here where we are returning the step to render. Okay, it will be called from the view. Okay, then when it's called from the view, and this will happen each and every time that the re-render cycle happens. So we will call this method, then the method will check the most current, okay, the most current form step from the list of available sign up steps. All right, then it will return that component itself. All right, and that's just it. Nothing to add, nothing to remove. The reason we are having it here is that we don't want to duplicate so many components here. So that's why we just have it like this, and then it returns one step component. You see, we are calling it step component. We are not calling it personal details. We're not calling it contact information. Then it will have its own events that are emitted from it, and also the values that are passed into it. All right. Okay. So if we expand this use effect, we see that it actually serves one purpose, and the purpose is just setting the active step index. And this one is actually set by calling the set active step index, which we just saw here. All right. Okay. All right, finally, we have this part here on submit form. This, what it simply does, it just gets the form, the whole form of the multi-steps. As we said, like we are just going to reduce it. We get the keys and the keys and the values of each and every step, and then we have them condensed into one form and return this form. So, for example, when we come here and we try logging it out, we should see let's go all the way to the end. We submit, we should see like the values, right? Then we go back, we say maybe we change something like here. We go all the way to the end again. We submit, we should see updated value for the email address, and we see it as updated. Okay, I believe that's it. Let's continue. Okay, finally, we get to take a look at our return value from our sign up component. First thing we see is that we need to have a current step so that we can render something, all right? And you have seen how to initialize the current step. The other important part I want you to focus on are the components that we are having. We have the header, we have the navigation, we have the footer, but we have another important component that is here, that is being returned from this method. And this component is our dynamic component. These are now the sequence of steps. For example, the personal, the contact details, the experience. And if we take a look at our sign up steps, as we said, we just have the key, label, and component. This component is what will be returning, okay, if we find it. And then the next thing is simply emitting, all right, from that component. Remember, it can be either of type personal details, of type contact information, and then we are going to be passing in initial fields. These initial fields that we'll be passing in are what we have actually filled in incrementally over time. Okay, all right. All right, so now that we understand how the sign up page works and how the hook is being used, let's take a look at this part here where we are actually injecting the specific components. In this case, is a personal details component. Let's open this up and we should see that it accepts a couple of properties. The first one is the select initial fields. These are the initial fields which will be passed in when we go forward. Then we come back, you see, like if we change this to 1, then we next, and then we come back, the initial value will be 1, so it will be passed in. Then on view field change, what happens with this emitter is that when we change this to 2, 3, 4, this value is being emitted, and that's what will trigger this method. Then lastly, on step validity change, it will be triggered when this step, personal detail steps, actually is valid. The form is valid itself. So now it's not valid, but we change to 1, 2, 3, 4 is actually valid. All right. So the next part is here. Let's start with this section here. Yeah, the highlighted part. You see, we have the view name, and also we have our useBaseStep. This is the hook that we are calling actually, and it's right here. Okay, so we are passing in the view name, and as you can see, we have additional parameters, but we'll take a look at them later on. But just to mention, first of all, we have the form fields property, we have the required form fields, we have the defaults. For example, as we saw in contact details, we are passing, for example, a default value for LinkedIn, for Twitter, and for YouTube. And then we have on view field change, and then we have our view name. All right, so let's go back here and we see how we get to do that. You see, we're only passing the required fields for these personal details because we don't need defaults, and we will need defaults, for example, in contact. So if we take a look at our contacts component, we see that we have the default fields, and these fields, when we pass them in, they will be initialized into the form, so that when we get to the end, even if we don't touch these fields, they will be having a value. Let's see how that happens. All right, as we go back to our browser, we have reached the end of this form. So if we submit, we should see something. These are the view names. So we have contact, we have experience, we have personal, and we have terms and conditions. And as you can see, we didn't need to touch on these fields. So if we go back all the way, this section, we didn't need to touch on this part here. And as we see, the data is still persistent. All right, and then for the experience, the values are there. So if we change this one to my email too, for example, and then we say next, and then we submit, let's submit, we should see that our email actually has been updated. All right, okay, let's continue. Okay, the other important part is where we have our effects. The first effect is for patching the initial fields, all right, based on the view name. So what happens is that we are selecting initial fields, and we are patching our current forms fields with the value we have received from the global form fields. So if we take a look at this method, we see is the one that we pass it in from here. Right here is this one, and this one, where does it come from? It comes all the way from our multi-step form. So when we look at it, we see that we are just passing in the view, and then we are reading from the form views the values that have been updated incrementally. That is why when we go back, we see these values pre-filled. Yeah, we don't need to fill them, and then we see they are already valid, and then button for going next is enabled. All right, so when we go back to our page details component, that's just it about that section. The other section is this part here. When the steps validity changes, we have to actually emit this event upwards, yeah, so that we can actually enable or disable the next button. All right. All right, so here at the bottom, we just have our return value from the personal details component, and the return value is a simple form. And the form, as you can see, it has a custom component, that is the input field component. This component accepts a type, a placeholder, an initial value, as well as on change event. So when we make a change, that change will be emitted from this component. And if we take a look at this component, we see there is nothing fancy here, just a simple styling with Tailwind CSS. And also we say the type that you have received in, the value if it's there, and also on change. But one thing I want you to note is here, like in the effect, we have to actually set the value if there is an initial value defined. All right, then when a change happens, we simply emit it, all right, and propagate it upwards back to personal details component. Then personal details component will actually update this value inside the base step, all right, for the form. and also propagate the value all the way up to our multi-steps, the root form views. You remember the root form views? That's where this change will also be propagated. All right. Okay, let's continue. All right, so all the other steps, they will take up structure similar to that of the personal details component. For example, if we take a look at contact step, we see that it takes a similar pattern. The view name is set, everything, but we add 3 more properties, and these properties are defaults and also on the change and view name. Why is that the case? Let's take a look at what this actually does and what this does as well when it comes to the use-based step. Okay. All right, now I want you to focus on this section. Like here, this effect will only be triggered when the default values are present. And why do we need these ones? When we pass them in, we will iterate through the defaults that have been set. For example, in the contact, the defaults are LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and they all have a default value. All right. Then we will come final here and emit the value, all right? And that is where we actually get to pass in the view name, we pass in the field. For example, if it's LinkedIn and we pass in the value that was the default for LinkedIn. For example, in our contact component, we see these are what we'll be passing in, okay? And then this will be propagated all the way upwards, all right, to our global form views. And the form views that we're talking about are the ones that are here in our use multi-step form hook. Okay, all right. Okay, and this way we will be able to actually use these defaults as though we manually keyed in the values. We will not miss out on them. What I mean by that is this. Let's comment this out here. Actually, let's copy this, comment it out, and then we actually add it here. We go to our UI. So to explain this, let me fill this form really quick. Go next, we see they are pre-filled. We didn't touch these fields, they are pre-filled, okay? Then we go to mail, we set mail there. Then we say 8, right? Then we say submit. One thing you note, we don't have our LinkedIn, we don't have all our contacts. But if we come back, for example, here, and we just change the LinkedIn, we just touch the field, and then what happens is that we submit, we should now be able to see LinkedIn. So that is why we actually need the defaults feature, okay? All right. So as you can see, it was so easy to have this up and running. So let's recap what we just worked on today. The first part is our component. Which component do we want to have the multi-step? In our case, it's a sign-up component. You just invoke the use multi-step form hook. And our hook, what it does is that it persists the state that is specific to our sign-up, as in our case. Then we have our useBaseStep that will actually isolate this the state for each and every step that we are at. And then all these, they're just those components which we are injecting. And finally, we just have one common shared component, which is our input field. All right? Okay. And with that, always remember, you stop growing when you stop learning. And everything that you learn, go further and teach someone that you may grow together. Okay? All right. Until the next one.